The afternoon sun shone softly over the bustling streets of the city. Snoop Dogg, the legendary rapper and global icon, had chosen a quiet corner to relax and reflect. Dressed casually in a hoodie and sweatpants, he looked like any ordinary man, blending seamlessly into his surroundings. This was how Snoop liked it, low-key and grounded, far from the glare of cameras and the noise of fame. Despite his larger-than-life career, Snoop had always remained connected to his roots, never forgetting the struggles he faced growing up in Long Beach. From the challenges of street life to his meteoric rise in the music industry, his journey had been anything but easy. Moments like this, sitting alone with nothing but his thoughts, brought him rare peace amid his hectic life. But that peace was about to be shattered. Heavy footsteps echoed down the empty street, bouncing off the brick pavement. Snoop looked up, his instinctive alertness kicking in. A police officer was approaching, his expression cold and filled with barely concealed contempt. This was Officer Walker, notorious in the area for his aggressive and unchecked behavior. "You think you can just sit here?" Walker's tone was sharp, laced with mockery. Snoop remained calm, his years of navigating tense situations grounding him. He didn't respond immediately, keeping a steady gaze on the officer. Inside, however, a familiar tension began to rise. "This isn't a hangout spot," Walker continued, his words dripping with sarcasm. His eyes scanned Snoop from head to toe, clearly making judgments based on his appearance. "This is a decent neighborhood, not a place for people like you." Snoop clenched his fists under the table, the insult cutting deep. But he didn't let his emotions show. Years of enduring stereotypes had taught him to keep his cool in the face of provocation. "I'm just sitting here taking a moment," he said, his voice even but firm. Walker sneered, his smile devoid of any warmth. "You don't get how things work around here, do you? I decide what's right and wrong, and you sitting here is wrong." Snoop could feel the tension building, but he held his ground. He knew he had to tread carefully. Walker was the kind of cop who thrived on pushing situations to their breaking point. "You don't have the right to tell me I can't sit here," Snoop said calmly, locking eyes with Walker. The officer's face hardened. "You think you're smart, huh?" He stepped closer, his posture aggressive, his hand resting lightly on his gun belt, a silent but deliberate warning. "Maybe I should teach you a lesson about respecting the law." Snoop's heart raced, but his expression didn't falter. He had faced countless challenges in his life, but this was different, a blatant abuse of power happening in broad daylight. Walker took another step forward, now close enough that Snoop could see the disdain etched into his face. The rapper's mind raced, weighing his next move carefully. He knew that any sudden reaction could escalate the situation, and he wasn't about to let Walker have that satisfaction. "Stand up," Walker ordered, his tone commanding, his fingers lightly brushing the holster of his weapon. His gaze swept over the quiet street, as though looking for an audience or a witness to justify what was about to happen. But there was no one around, and the silence made the tension even more suffocating. "I'm not breaking any law," Snoop replied, his voice steady but firm. He remained seated, not out of defiance, but because he knew his rights. Years of working in the spotlight had taught him the importance of staying composed, even in situations as hostile as this. Walker smirked, leaning down slightly, his breath now audible. "Who do you think you are? A superstar? Let me make this clear. No one is above the rules. Anyone can be dragged to the station if I decide it's necessary." Snoop didn't flinch. His silence only seemed to fuel Walker's anger. Without warning, Walker raised his hand and shoved Snoop's shoulder forcefully. Snoop stumbled slightly but regained his balance quickly, his years of composure keeping him rooted. His eyes burned with a quiet anger, but he held his ground, refusing to give Walker the reaction he seemed to want. "You have no right to do that," Snoop said, his voice low and clear, each word deliberate and calm. Walker didn't back off. Instead, he grabbed Snoop's arm, yanking him roughly to his feet. "Do you think anyone is here to protect you?" His voice dropped to a threatening whisper, filled with venom. "Let me show you something. Here. I am the law." The pain in Snoop's arm was sharp, but he didn't let it show. His heart pounded, and for a brief moment, a flood of memories surged through his mind. The years of struggle, the moments when he had fought against stereotypes and systemic injustices. But he knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about standing firm for everyone who had been in his shoes. Suddenly a voice rang out from behind, sharp and authoritative. "Take your hands off him, now." Walker froze, his grip loosening slightly. He turned, his expression shifting from anger to surprise as he saw Daniel Reed approaching. Daniel was an onlooker who had been observing the scene from across the street, his face set with determination. "And who are you?" Walker barked, his voice dripping with irritation. "This is none of your business. Move along." Daniel didn't falter, taking a step closer. "I'm someone who won't stand by and let this happen. That's all you need to know," he said firmly, his voice calm but resolute. Snoop glanced at Daniel, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face. For the first time during this encounter, he didn't feel entirely alone. Walker's lips curled into a sneer. "This is just a misunderstanding," he said mockingly. "But I'd advise you to stay out of police matters if you don't want trouble." Daniel stepped forward unfazed. "I'm not afraid of trouble, especially when it comes to protecting someone's rights. And if you think your abuse of power will go unnoticed, you're wrong." Walker's grip on Snoop's arm loosened further, though the tension in his demeanor didn't waver. His gaze darted from Daniel to Snoop, his frustration mounting. He was visibly conflicted, his ego clashing with the unexpected resistance. "I'll remember this," Walker growled through gritted teeth. Slowly, he released Snoop, stepping back, but not without a final, piercing glare. "Don't think this is over. You'd better be careful. Not everyone will be here to save you." Daniel shifted his stance slightly, standing protectively in front of Snoop. "We'll see who really needs to be careful, Officer Walker." The silence that followed was heavy, the air charged with unspoken tension. Walker eventually turned on his heel, retreating with heavy steps toward his patrol car. He climbed in, slamming the door shut with enough force to echo down the empty street. With one last menacing look, he drove off, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. As the tension ebbed away, Snoop exhaled deeply, the first sign of relief washing over him. He turned to Daniel, his expression a mix of gratitude and weariness. "Man, I appreciate you stepping in. That could have gone south real quick." Daniel nodded, his gaze softening but still resolute. "No one should have to go through that. We need to make sure he's held accountable for this." Snoop stood in silence for a moment, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady now. "We do." But just as the relief began to settle, the sound of another patrol car pulling up broke the moment. Red and blue lights flashed, illuminating the dim street. Two officers stepped out, their faces stern, their strides purposeful. They approached Snoop and Daniel without hesitation. "We need you to come with us," one officer said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. His eyes lacked any trace of empathy. Daniel immediately stepped forward, his expression hardening. "And what exactly is the reason for this?" The officer barely glanced at him. "We're responding to a report. We'll need to sort this out at the station." Snoop raised his hand slightly in mock surrender, though his expression was calm, almost resigned. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath. He turned to Daniel and added quietly, "Don't let this spiral. Get a lawyer." Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but Snoop gave him a reassuring look. "It's cool, man. I've dealt with worse. Just make sure they play this by the book." Reluctantly, Daniel nodded. "I'll make the call. Don't let them do anything without legal counsel." Snoop offered him a small, almost amused smile before stepping toward the patrol car. The officers didn't hesitate to lead him to the vehicle, their actions mechanical and impersonal. As the car door slammed shut, Daniel stood rooted to the spot, his fists clenched in silent frustration. The patrol car pulled away, its taillights vanishing into the distance, leaving Daniel standing alone on the dimly lit street. His mind raced as he fished his phone out of his pocket, quickly dialing the number of the best lawyer he could think of. "Hey, Sandra," Daniel said as soon as the call connected. "It's urgent. They just took Snoop in." "Yeah, that's Snoop." "No charges were mentioned." "It's all bogus. We need to act fast." Meanwhile, inside the patrol car, Snoop sat straight-backed, his gaze fixed on the flashing city lights beyond the window. His expression was unreadable, but his mind was far from calm. Memories of past injustices and hard-learned lessons filled his thoughts. He clenched his fists slightly, determined not to let this incident define him. Upon arrival at the police station, Snoop was ushered into a stark, fluorescent-lit holding area. The officer's demeanor was cold and indifferent as they processed him, ignoring his status and treating him as if he were a mere nuisance. Snoop remained quiet, watching every move they made, his sharp eyes taking in the details for later. As he was led into the interrogation room, he was met with a familiar face. Officer Walker, who stood smugly by the door. His expression was laced with malice as he folded his arms, leaning casually against the wall. "Guess you're not as untouchable as you thought," Walker said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Snoop sat down slowly at the metal table in the center of the room, leaning back in his chair with an air of unbothered confidence. "You think this is about me?" Snoop asked, his voice low and steady. "This ain't the first time I've seen this kind of game, and I promise you, it's not gonna end the way you think." Walker's smirk faltered for just a moment before he straightened, crossing his arms more tightly. "You talk a lot for someone who's about to learn a lesson." "Maybe it's you who needs to learn something," Snoop shot back, his tone still calm but carrying an edge. "See, people are watching now, and once this story gets out, the only thing they're gonna see is how you overstepped." Walker's expression darkened. He opened his mouth to respond but was interrupted by the sharp sound of the door swinging open. Sandra Mills walked in, a commanding presence in her tailored suit. Behind her was Daniel, his face set in determination. "Officer Walker," Sandra began, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Unless you have an official charge, I suggest you step outside. I'm Mr. Broaddus's legal counsel now, and I'll be speaking with my client alone." Walker scowled, but Sandra's unwavering gaze left no room for argument. With a grunt of annoyance, he stalked out, slamming the door behind him. Sandra waited for a moment before turning to Snoop, her sharp eyes scanning his face. "You okay?" she asked, her tone softening slightly. Snoop nodded. "I've seen worse. Let's just handle this." Sandra opened her briefcase, pulling out a notepad and pen. "Tell me everything, from the beginning. We're not letting this slide." As Snoop recounted the events, his voice calm but resolute, Sandra took detailed notes, her pen moving swiftly across the page. Daniel sat nearby, his arms crossed, a silent pillar of support. When Snoop finished, Sandra closed her notebook with a decisive snap. "Walker's actions were reckless and unjustified," she said firmly. "This isn't just about you, Snoop. It's about holding the system accountable. And trust me, we will." Sandra straightened her posture, exuding authority, as she walked out of the interrogation room with Daniel and Snoop following close behind. The officers who had been standing idly in the hallway now exchanged nervous glances, clearly uneasy with the presence of such a high-profile lawyer. Sandra's reputation preceded her, and the intensity of her demeanor left little room for defiance. As they approached the front desk, Sandra spoke sharply to the officer on duty. "I need to see whoever is in charge of this station immediately," she demanded, her voice carrying a weight that echoed through the hall. The officer stammered, hesitating for a moment before nodding. "Right away, ma'am." Within minutes, the station's commanding officer appeared, a middle-aged man with a stiff posture and a furrowed brow. His badge read, Captain Morris. He offered a cursory glance at Sandra, his eyes briefly landing on Snoop before returning to Sandra with a professional yet wary expression. "What seems to be the problem here?" Captain Morris asked, his voice steady but guarded. Sandra stepped forward, her heels clicking against the tiled floor with purpose. "The problem is that my client, Mr. Broaddus, was unlawfully detained without any justification," she stated, her tone unwavering. "He was subjected to harassment and intimidation by Officer Walker, who clearly abused his authority. We need answers, Captain, and we need them now." Captain Morris's eyes flickered with discomfort. He cleared his throat, glancing briefly at the officers lingering in the background. "I assure you, Miss Mills, we take these matters very seriously. If there's been any misconduct, "There's no if about it," Sandra interrupted, her voice firm. "This isn't speculation. It's fact. You'll find plenty of witnesses to corroborate Mr. Broaddus's account. And let me remind you, Captain, that detaining someone of his stature without cause will not only damage your department's reputation, but could have significant legal ramifications." Snoop stood silently behind Sandra, his presence commanding despite his calm demeanor. Daniel's arms remained crossed, his expression dark with frustration. Captain Morris sighed, clearly feeling the weight of the situation. "I'll look into it personally," he said, his tone more conciliatory now. "If Officer Walker overstepped, appropriate action will be taken." "That's not good enough," Sandra countered. "We're not here to wait for internal processes to drag on indefinitely. I'll be filing a formal complaint first thing in the morning, and in the meantime I expect my client to leave this station immediately, without any further delays or harassment." Captain Morris hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Of course, Mr. Broaddus is free to go." The tension in the room didn't ease even as the captain spoke the words. Sandra's sharp gaze remained fixed on him for a moment longer, silently conveying that this was far from over. With a curt nod, she turned to Snoop and Daniel. "Let's go," she said. As the three of them exited the station, the cool night air hit their faces, a stark contrast to the stifling tension inside. Snoop paused for a moment, glancing back at the building, his expression unreadable. "This isn't just about me," Snoop said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. "This is about everyone who's had to deal with this kind of injustice. We're not letting it slide." Sandra nodded, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Damn right we're not." Daniel clapped a hand on Snoop's shoulder, a small but significant gesture of solidarity. "We've got your back, man. All the way." As they walked away from the station, the first steps of a larger fight had been taken. A fight not just for one man, but for something much bigger. As Snoop, Sandra, and Daniel exited the station, they were immediately met by a growing crowd of reporters and onlookers. News of Snoop Dogg's arrest had spread like wildfire, drawing attention from both fans and critics. The camera flashes were blinding, and the hum of voices created a chaotic backdrop. Microphones were thrust toward them as reporters shouted over one another. "Snoop, can you tell us what happened inside? Is it true you were wrongfully detained? What's your next move?" Sandra raised a hand, signaling for silence. Her commanding presence quieted the crowd, and the reporters eagerly leaned in for her response. "My client, Mr. Broaddus, was unlawfully detained without justification," Sandra began, her voice steady and authoritative. "This incident is yet another example of systemic abuse of power and racial profiling. We intend to take immediate legal action against all responsible parties." Snoop stepped forward, his gaze scanning the crowd. Despite the chaos, he appeared calm, his voice steady as he addressed the press. "This ain't about me. This is about every black man and woman who's been stopped, questioned, and treated like they don't belong, just because of how they look. It's time to make real changes." The crowd buzzed with murmurs, the weight of his words sinking in. Daniel stood slightly behind Snoop, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of pride and determination. One reporter pushed through, her voice clear and direct. "Snoop, do you think your status as a public figure will help bring attention to these issues?" Snoop's eyes locked on hers. "I'm using every platform I've got to make sure people see what's really going on out here. But this isn't just my fight. It's all of ours." Sandra placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We'll provide a full statement tomorrow, but for now my client needs time to regroup. Thank you." With that, Sandra led the group away from the crowd, herding them into a waiting black SUV. Inside, the tension shifted slightly as the noise from the reporters faded behind closed doors. Snoop leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply. "This is going to be a long ride, huh?" Sandra smirked, flipping open her tablet to review her notes. "You have no idea, but you've got the spotlight now and we're going to use it." Daniel nodded, his voice calm but firm. "The system's not going to change on its own. We've got to keep the pressure on." Snoop looked out the window, the city lights flashing past. The weight of the day settled on him, but beneath the fatigue, a new determination burned. "Let's do this," he said quietly, his voice resolute. The SUV disappeared into the night, leaving behind the chaos of the station and the press. The fight was just beginning. The following morning, Snoop, Sandra, and Daniel gathered in Sandra's office, preparing for the legal and media battle ahead. The room was a mix of focus and tension as Sandra meticulously reviewed documents, while Daniel strategized their next moves. Snoop sat on the couch, his usually laid-back demeanor replaced by a rare seriousness. Sandra looked up from her notes. "Snoop, the media is going to dissect every part of this case. They're going to look into your past, your music, your public persona. Are you ready for that?" Snoop shrugged, his eyes sharp. "They've been trying to pick me apart my whole career. This ain't no different. But this time, it ain't about me. It's about what's right." Daniel nodded in agreement. "That's the attitude we need. But make no mistake, this is going to get ugly. The system doesn't like being challenged, especially by someone with your influence." Sandra placed a stack of papers on the table. "We need to prepare for every angle. The first step is filing the lawsuit. I'm drafting a claim for racial profiling, unlawful detainment, and emotional distress. We're also demanding a full investigation into Officer Walker and the department." Snoop leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Good. Let's shine a light on all of it. But what about the people? How do we keep them involved?" Sandra smiled slightly. "That's where your voice comes in. You've got millions of fans who trust you. If we want this case to make an impact, we need their support," Daniel chimed in. "Social media, interviews, rallies. You can use your platform to keep the pressure on. But we have to be strategic. The goal isn't just to win this case. It's to set a precedent." Snoop nodded slowly, his mind already working on how to use his influence for maximum effect. "I got you. Let's make some noise." Later that day, the trio held a press conference to officially announce the lawsuit. The room was packed with reporters, fans, and activists, all eager to hear from the iconic artist. Camera flashes lit up the podium as Sandra stepped forward to address the crowd. "Good afternoon," Sandra began, her voice steady and clear. "Today, we are taking a stand against systemic abuse of power. My client, Mr. Calvin Broadus, known to the world as Snoop Dogg, was wrongfully detained and humiliated. This lawsuit is not just about one incident, but about holding those in power accountable for their actions." The crowd murmured in agreement, the energy in the room palpable. Snoop stepped up to the microphone, his expression serious but passionate. "This ain't just about me. It's about every single person out there who's been stopped, harassed, or treated like they don't belong. This is about saying, enough is enough. I'm fighting this not just for myself, but for the culture, for the people who can't fight for themselves." Applause erupted, the room electrified by his words. Reporters shouted questions, but Sandra quickly stepped in to maintain order. "We'll take a few questions," she said, gesturing to a reporter in the front row. "Mr. Broadus, what do you hope to achieve with this lawsuit?" the reporter asked. Snoop's gaze was unwavering. "Justice, not just for me, but for everybody who's been through this. We're sending a message. You can't keep doing this to us." Another reporter chimed in. "Do you think your status as a celebrity will help or hurt this case?" Snoop smirked. "Depends on who you ask. But I'm going to use what I got to make sure people hear the truth." Sandra ended the press conference on a high note, thanking everyone for their support and urging the public to stay informed. As they left the podium, the crowd's energy followed them, a wave of determination and solidarity. Back at the office, the team reviewed the day's events. Sandra was pleased with the turnout, while Daniel was already mapping out their next steps. Snoop leaned back in his chair, his earlier tension replaced by a quiet confidence. "We got their attention," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Now let's make it count." Sandra nodded. "This is just the beginning. We've got a long fight ahead, but with the truth on our side, we'll get there." Daniel placed a supportive hand on Snoop's shoulder. "We're with you every step of the way." Snoop glanced at his team, a rare smile breaking through his serious demeanor. "Then let's get to work." As the lawsuit gained traction, The story spread like wildfire. News outlets, social media platforms, and even late-night talk shows buzzed with debates about Snoop Dogg's case. Supporters rallied behind him, sharing their own experiences of discrimination and police misconduct, while critics tried to discredit him by dredging up past controversies. One evening, as Snoop scrolled through his phone, he came across countless messages of support from fans. Stories of people facing similar injustices flooded his timeline. "Keep fighting for us, Snoop," one message read. Another said, "You're our voice. Don't let them silence you." Snoop put his phone down and looked across the room at Daniel and Sandra. "This is bigger than I thought. People are counting on this." Sandra nodded. "That's exactly why we can't back down. Every story they're sharing is more evidence of how widespread this problem is." Daniel added, "But it's also why we have to be careful. The other side will use anything they can to undermine the movement." The team's resolve was tested when a smear campaign against Snoop began circulating. Headlines accused him of using the case for publicity, while critics dredged up moments from his past to paint him as untrustworthy. One morning, Daniel stormed into the office, slamming a tabloid onto the table. "Look at this garbage," he fumed. "Snoop Dogg's lawsuit, a PR stunt? They're trying to turn public opinion against us." Sandra remained calm, picking up the tabloid and flipping through the pages. "We knew this was coming. They're trying to distract from the real issue." Snoop leaned back in his chair, unbothered by the attacks. "Let 'em talk. I've been dealing with haters my whole life. This ain't new. What matters is we stay focused." Daniel sighed, his frustration easing at Snoop's calm demeanor. "You're right. But we need to counter this narrative before it spreads too far." Sandra tapped her pen against the table, thinking, "The best way to fight this is with transparency. Let's address it head on. We'll schedule an interview with a trusted journalist, someone who won't twist the story." Snoop nodded. "Let's do it. The people need to hear the truth." A few days later, Snoop sat across from a renowned journalist in a studio. The lights were bright, the cameras rolling, and millions of viewers tuned in to watch. The journalist began with a tough question. "Snoop, some critics say this lawsuit is just a way for you to stay relevant. How do you respond to that?" Snoop leaned forward, his voice steady and sincere. "Let me tell you something. I don't need a lawsuit to stay relevant. I've been relevant for decades. This ain't about me. It's about what's right. People out there are going through this every day, and they don't have the platform I do. I'm using mine to stand up for them." The journalist followed up. "Do you think your past will affect how people view this case?" Snoop smirked. "My past made me who I am today. Yeah, I've made mistakes, but I've learned from them. And if my story gives hope to someone out there, then it's worth it." The interview ended with a powerful statement from Snoop. "This ain't just about me walking into court and winning a case. It's about changing a system that's been broken for too long, and I ain't stopping till we see real change." After the interview aired, public support surged. The hashtag #NonJusticeWithSnoop began trending, and activists from around the world voiced their solidarity. Sandra and Daniel worked tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering evidence, preparing witnesses, and coordinating with community leaders. But not everyone was on their side. Anonymous threats and warnings began to surface, attempting to intimidate Snoop into dropping the case. One evening, as the team worked late, Sandra's phone buzzed with a concerning message. She showed it to Snoop and Daniel. "They're trying to scare us," Sandra said, her voice firm. "But it's not going to work." Snoop glanced at the message and shook his head. "If they think threats are going to stop me, they don't know who they're messing with. We're not just fighting for me, we're fighting for everybody." As the trial date approached, the tension grew, but so did the team's determination. Snoop knew the road ahead would be tough, but he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. "Let's make history," he said one night, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "For everyone who's been where I am and couldn't fight back, we're going to change the game." The trial began under intense public scrutiny, with cameras stationed outside the courthouse and supporters rallying in solidarity. As Snoop Dogg entered the courtroom, flanked by Daniel and Sandra, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but resolute. The defense wasted no time trying to paint Snoop in a negative light, bringing up incidents from his past in an attempt to discredit him. Sandra, however, was unshaken. When it was her turn to address the court, she stood tall, her voice commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sandra began, her tone measured but firm. "This case isn't about who Snoop Dogg was 20 years ago. It's about what happened that day and the abuse of power by someone who swore to protect and serve. Let's focus on the facts and not let distractions cloud the truth." The prosecution called several witnesses to testify about Officer Walker's pattern of behavior, including Officer Grant, whose testimony was critical. Taking the stand, Grant spoke with courage despite the tension in the room. "I've worked with Officer Walker for years," Grant stated. "I've seen his actions and turned a blind eye for too long. But I can't stay silent anymore. What he did to Snoop Dogg was not just unprofessional, it was an abuse of power." The defense attempted to discredit Grant, accusing him of having a vendetta against Walker. But Grant remained composed, his responses clear and unwavering. "My motive is simple," he said. "It's justice. If we don't hold people accountable for their actions, the system will never change." Snoop took the stand next, his demeanor calm yet filled with conviction. The defense lawyer tried to provoke him, questioning his motives and bringing up past controversies. "Snoop, isn't it true that you've had run-ins with the law before?" the defense lawyer asked, smirking as if he'd scored a point. Snoop leaned forward, locking eyes with the lawyer. "Yeah, I've had my share of mistakes, but that don't mean I deserve to be treated like less than human. This ain't about my past. It's about what's right, and what happened to me ain't right." Sandra used the opportunity to highlight Snoop's growth and the impact he'd made on his community. "Mr. Dogg has used his platform to uplift others, advocating for justice and equality. The question isn't about his past. It's about whether anyone, regardless of their background, should face abuse of power." The trial continued with heated arguments from both sides. The defense leaned heavily on character attacks, while Sandra and Daniel focused on the systemic issues highlighted by the case. Witness after witness corroborated Snoop's account of events, painting a damning picture of Officer Walker's conduct. As closing arguments approached, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Sandra addressed the jury with passion and clarity. "This case is bigger than Snoop Dogg," she said. "It's about a broken system that allows those in power to act without accountability. Today, you have the chance to send a message that abuse of power will not be tolerated and justice will be upheld." The defense countered with their final remarks, but the cracks in their arguments were evident. The weight of the evidence, coupled with the powerful testimonies, left the jury with much to consider. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide the outcome. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Bryce Walker, guilty on all counts." A wave of emotion swept through the room. Snoop closed his eyes, exhaling deeply as the weight of the moment sank in. Sandra smiled, her confidence vindicated, while Daniel clapped Snoop on the back. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers as the news spread. Supporters waved signs and chanted slogans, celebrating the landmark victory. Snoop stepped out of the courthouse, greeted by a sea of cameras and microphones. When asked for a statement, Snoop's words resonated deeply. "This ain't just a win for me. It's a win for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly. We gotta keep fighting to make sure this system works for all of us, not just some of us." The victory was more than just a legal triumph. It was a turning point in the fight for justice. Snoop knew the journey wasn't over, but he also knew he wasn't alone. With Sandra, Daniel, and countless supporters by his side, he was ready to keep pushing for change. "Let's keep it moving," he said, looking out at the crowd. "This is just the beginning." As the courthouse emptied, Snoop Dogg stood on the steps, a symbol of resilience and courage. The victory wasn't just personal, it sent a powerful message about accountability and the need for systemic change. Surrounding him were Sandra, Daniel, and Officer Grant, whose decision to speak up had been a critical turning point in the case. Reporters pressed forward, eager for final comments, Sandra stepped forward first, her voice steady and authoritative. This case has shown that no one is above the law, not even those who wear a badge. Justice was served today, but this is only the beginning. We must continue to challenge abuse and fight for equality. Daniel followed, his tone full of determination. This wasn't just about one man or one incident. It's about creating a system where everyone is treated with dignity and fairness. That's the fight we're committed to. Snoop then addressed the crowd, his words carrying the weight of his experience and the hope for a better future. We made history today, but we can't stop here. For every person like me who got their day in court, there's 100 more who didn't. We gotta keep speaking up, keep pushing, and keep building a better world for the next generation. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices unified in support. Flashbulbs captured the moment as Snoop raised his fist in solidarity, a gesture mirrored by those around him. In the days that followed, the verdict sparked nationwide discussions about police accountability and the fight against systemic racism. Media outlets ran stories highlighting the broader implications of the case, and grassroots organizations used the momentum to push for reforms. Snoop returned to his work, using his platform to amplify these efforts. He hosted community forums, collaborated with activists, and funded initiatives aimed at creating lasting change. His story inspired countless individuals to stand up against injustice and demand fairness in their own communities. As Snoop looked out at a packed auditorium during one of these forums, he felt a deep sense of purpose. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been transformative. "This ain't just about me," he told the audience. "It's about all of us. Together we can create a world where justice isn't just a word. It's a reality. Let's get to work." The applause was thunderous, echoing the collective determination of a community united in its quest for justice. The story of Snoop Dogg's fight became a testament to the power of perseverance, solidarity, and courage. It reminded everyone that change is possible, but it requires action, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to what's right. This chapter had closed, but the movement it sparked was just beginning.